Welcome to Day 99 on the Trail. We have 5 readings for today. From Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 31, Numbers 6, verses 1 through 27, the 93rd Psalm, Proverbs 30, verses 1 through 33, and Judith chapter 6, verses 14 through 21. As we learned on Day 97, in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, Paul offers his thesis statement. These are 2 brief verses which will guide us through the remainder of the book of Romans. And then, beginning in chapter 1, verse 18, Paul describes why his thesis statement is so important. That is, how our sinful choices and failure to honor God leads to God's judgment. Well, today, we get some good news. Paul is going to return to his thesis statement, but now he will expand on this statement to help us better understand why this is history-changing good news from God. Therefore, it may be helpful to return to the thesis statement and remind ourselves of what Paul said there. So Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. If you recall, we focused on a specific part of verse 17, which contains some very concise statements. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, or more literally, out of faith to faith. Since Paul is going to expand on these statements, let us now turn to Romans 3, beginning in verse 21. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed, and it is attested by the law and the prophets. The righteousness of God, through faith in Jesus Christ, for all who believe. First, note the similarity with the thesis statement. The righteousness of God, both the righteousness belonging to God and God's activity to establish a right relationship with us. That has been disclosed. And this is not completely unexpected. Paul points out that both the Torah, or the law, and the prophets have spoken of this. But how has this been disclosed, according to Paul? In the thesis statement in verse 17, Paul said, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. Again, literally, out of faith to faith. Our question at that point was, how is God's righteousness revealed in this way? From whose faith to whose faith? Here is where we may find verse 22 helpful. In the New Revised Standard Version, which we have been following on this podcast along the trail, it translates verse 22 as follows. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. However, the Greek text is slightly different. In fact, you may note in the New Revised Standard, there's a footnote added to this text, which indicates a possible different translation. So this is how verse 22 might also be translated. The righteousness of God through the faith of Jesus Christ to all who are faithful. I believe this translation, which follows the Greek more closely, is a better fit for Paul's thesis statement. That is, the righteousness of God is revealed or disclosed through the faithfulness of Jesus to all who are faithful. That is, from the faith of Jesus to our faith. So first, Paul reminds us that the faithfulness of Jesus, a faith which led him to the cross, is of infinite importance. Jesus' faith mattered. When Jesus asked God to take this cup of suffering from him in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was actually struggling. His sacrifice and suffering were real. Yet Jesus faithfully chose God's will. God trusted Jesus to accomplish his mission, and Jesus trusted his Father. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, the author writes, "We have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin." God's righteousness is revealed in the faithfulness of Jesus, and Jesus' faithfulness to God reveals God's righteousness to our faith, to all who are faithful. Paul then goes a step further. Jesus' faithfulness is not only the way in which God reveals his righteousness and acts to restore us to a right relationship with him, but Jesus' faithfulness is also something that we are called to emulate. Take a look at verse 25 and 26. He did this to show his righteousness, because in his divine forbearance, he passed over the sins previously committed. It was to prove at the present time that he himself is righteous, and that he justifies the one who has faith in Jesus. Now, once again, in most translations, the last two words are translated in Jesus. However, we again have a footnote which indicates that the Greek text could be translated of Jesus. This exact phrase is used in Romans 4, verse 16, which ends by saying, "But also to those who share the faith of Abraham." Now, obviously, we would not translate this as faith in Abraham. Therefore, the same principle, especially when used in the same letter by the same author, should apply to Romans 3:26. So a better translation would read, "It was to prove at the present time that he himself is righteous, and that he justifies the one who has the faith of Jesus." Why is this change in prepositions from faith in Jesus to faith of Jesus so important? What is the difference between having faith in Jesus and having the faith of Jesus? Well, quite a bit. Faith in Jesus is only the beginning. Having the faith of Jesus is a lifetime journey. We are not only to trust the one who saves us, but we are to live like him. God's righteousness is revealed through the faithfulness of Jesus to our faith, which should be like his. Our faith is more than belief. Faith is something by which we live. How we live, how we walk through this world every day. Living the faith of Jesus is a response of our whole person. The faithfulness of Jesus leaves an indelible impression on every facet of our lives and on our faithfulness to him. This impression of faith that Jesus leaves upon us is not only formed by what he said, but by the impression of the tears that fell upon the ground at Lazarus' tomb, the impression of his hands touching a man covered in leprosy, the impression of rocks on his feet as he traveled the dusty roads of this world to show us how to live within it, the impression of nails driven into his hands, open wide to bring us home. That is the impression that he left upon those who follow him. And that is the impression of faith that they have passed down to us. And it is that faithful impression that we are called to leave upon the world as well. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.